Well, good evening, or good afternoon if that's the time where you are. I'm Daniel Benjamin, and since July 1, I have the pleasure and the honor to be the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event entitled Washington Disrupted, Trump, the Election, and What Comes Next with Susan Glasser, who is the Academy's John Kluge Distinguished Visitor in, alas, a remote sort of way, and a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, where she writes a weekly column called The Letter from Trump's Washington. I can't think of a better guest for our first regular event of the fall of the election year 2020 than Susan Glasser, one of America's foremost political reporters. And Susan has been one of the stars in the journalistic heavens for many years now. Before joining the New Yorker, she was the editor of Politico, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, and a distinguished editor and reporter at the Washington Post. She reported for the Post from Moscow and covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. And with her husband, Peter Baker, now the White House correspondent for the New York Times, she co-authored Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin, and the End of the Revolution. Next week will be a big week for Susan Glasser and Peter Baker, because on the 29th, their book, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, will be published. And it's a big, and I mean big, 720-page book. And it's a hugely impressive biography of the former Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, White House Chief of Staff. Like many great biographies, it is also a portrait of a world, and in this case, a recent but largely vanished world, the Washington of the last decades of the Cold War and the immediate aftermath. I've almost finished it. Susan was kind enough to send me an advance copy, and I can't recommend it highly enough. For German speakers, I should also bring to your attention a copy of Brief aus Trump's Washington, a collection of Susan's New Yorker columns that came out in translation here in Germany earlier this year. So Susan, thanks so much for joining us. It is tempting, of course, to start off by asking what writing a 720-page book over many years with one's husband does to a marriage, but I am going to save that for your upcoming visit to the American Academy in Berlin, which we look forward to as soon as the travel restrictions are ended. I think I have read every column you have written since the inauguration. And to put it bluntly, I come away from your reportage thinking that I've heard in the elegant prose that we associate with the New Yorker, something that approximates a deeply civilized and thoughtful person's primal scream. And which is to say that the relentless breaking of norms, the cascade of mind-bending news in Trump's Washington has affected you powerfully. Is that fair to say? And what is it like to do what you do now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dan. It's really delightful to be with you, and congratulations on the new gig. What a wonderful, wonderful institution the American Academy is. And I must say that Peter and I are very sorry not to be there in person, and we are planning to hold you to your word. So I won't go on at length, but to answer your first question, the good news is that Peter and I are still talking to each other after having written this book together. And luckily, it's not our first book. As you mentioned, we wrote Kremlin Rising together, which actually we finished on the same day that our son was born. Again, you know, we've had not good success with collaborations so far. But we are excited to have the Jim Baker biography come out. It's 7 years in the making, largely because of the disruptions of the Trump era and distractions that we didn't expect. We thought we'd really finish it up as foreign correspondents again, but we're called back from a posting in Jerusalem. In my case, I had been there 3 weeks after the 2020 election, when the New York Times decided correctly that they probably should have Peter come back to cover the blowing up, in effect, of this White House. And that's where I would start by answering your question about what it's like to be a journalist today in Washington. Because the truth is, in many ways for me, it's been like being a foreign correspondent in my own land. And the things that Trump has not just said but done as president are really so extraordinary that a lot of the challenge, at least as I've defined it for myself, is finding a language and a vocabulary to make sure that we're still focused on what is that which is truly extraordinary about what Trump is doing and saying, and not just the laws, but the norms and the political culture of Washington that's being disrupted along the way. Because even in Berlin, people I'm sure are exhausted by the American news cycle, and I think that's part of the goal of it. In a way, Trump is aiming to sort of outrage us into submission. And actually, that's the column that I'm in the middle of typing that will go up hopefully later today or overnight your time, is a piece about not just Trump last night here in Washington refusing to guarantee the peaceful transfer of power, which, by the way, is not meant to be a trick question for an American president, but seeing this in the context of a September that is already filled with some of the most extraordinary things ever done and said in history, I would argue, by an American president. And yet we've already forgotten many of them. So trying to write all that down is a lot of the challenge.
So the big news of the last 10 days, of course, is the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the White House's decision to nominate a new justice for the Supreme Court. And this would seem to have the potential to transform the race. Certainly norm breaking again in the decision to push through a nomination so close to the election. Now, you can imagine that this will mobilize conservative voters in a serious way, because the Supreme Court has been at the heart of their concern about our politics for a very long time, certainly going back to the years after Roe v. Wade. But at the same time, we'll see a big mobilization on the other side for those who support a woman's right to choose, and from gay rights advocates as well. The context for all of this, of course, is a coronavirus pandemic that has claimed 200,000 lives, which is to say more than died in all of America's wars in the 20th and the 21st century, except for World War II. So, now the what hangs in the balance, is it still going to be a referendum on Donald Trump, or is it going to be a referendum on a vote of choice on whether or not to have a conservative majority on the Supreme Court? How do you see it unfolding?
Well, look, anybody who claims to have a crystal ball in this political environment in the U.S., don't believe them. I've got a bridge, I can tell you, in Brooklyn. But in reality, a lot of our conventional wisdoms have been proven to be wrong in the last few years. And this is one, historically, at least in recent times, people have felt here in Washington that it was conservative voters and Republicans who were more mobilized around the Supreme Court and judicial appointments because, first of all, of the extreme power that the anti-abortion movement had sort of obtained inside the Republican Party, and also because they saw it as really a decades-long project of institution building in order to essentially knock down the precedents that were established by a previous liberal majority on the Supreme Court. So this is like almost the culminating fight of the last few decades of mobilization on the religious right in the United States. And so obviously they aren't going to let something like an election get in the way of something that they've been working on since the 1970s, on the one hand. On the other hand, if they deliver that justice to the religious right before the election, well, that sort of takes a little bit of the wind out of their sails. Certainly, at least some of the evangelicals who have gotten in bed with Donald Trump, and I use that phrase advisedly, must have some discomfort with, putting their entire political movement's fortunes at the hands of a serial philandering, lying, very obviously not religious president. And so, what more can he give them? There is that issue. There's also the issue that perhaps at this point that turnout is counted on for Republicans. So then you do have this outpouring of grief and support for Ruth Bader Ginsburg that we're seeing here in Washington. Today, she's lying in state up on Capitol Hill. Yesterday was a very somber service outside the Supreme Court for her with the Chief Justice. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people lined up outside of the court right now to pay their respects to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And there was this very moving and kind of like, wow, scene this morning when the people who were on that line realized that Donald Trump and Melania had come up to pay their respects as well. First of all, you saw Trump in a mask, which is something you have only seen him once before, really, in the entire course of this pandemic. But when the people on the line realized that Trump was there, they spontaneously, and you can see the footage of this, it's very powerful, they spontaneously broke into a chant of, vote him out, vote him out. And Trump, who basically spent 4 years of his presidency not really appearing in public or not put himself in a position where he would be exposed to people who don't like him and to protesters, had to sort of stand there and take it, at least for a couple minutes. It was a really vivid scene. So I do think there's a lot of mobilization on the left as well as the right now.
And I'm just going to press you a little bit on this. A lot of mobilization. To what extent do you think the Biden strategy of continuing to focus on the virus and by extension, adding healthcare as a big concern because, of course, the court will again be reviewing the Affordable Care Act, and therefore the healthcare insurance of 20 million people will also be at stake. So do you think you can sort of handicap those two issues? And as a member of the press, which do you think will be of greater interest to reporters?
So I think that's a great question, and we don't know the answer yet, but I will say this. Americans' views, like those in the rest of the world, are pretty well made up about Donald Trump. And what's extraordinary, in fact, is how little any campaigning or any issues has anything to do with whether Donald Trump's approval rating goes up or down. If you look at it, it's like a straight line throughout his presidency. Donald Trump's approval rating today is essentially what it was 1 year ago, before 200,000 people were dead. It's essentially what it was 2 years ago, and 3 years ago, and 4 years ago. Joe Biden, his lead over Donald Trump, it's anywhere between 7 and 9 points nationally, closer in key battleground states, much closer in key battleground states. That lead, look at the line. It's a straight line. It's been exactly that same since Joe Biden announced that he was running for president, which means that it's been essentially unchanged. Although, again, so we're talking about the margins. I'm not saying that campaigning doesn't matter, because in fact, it's close enough that it's on the margins that it does matter. So many people in politics, both Barack Obama before Donald Trump and now Donald Trump, essentially have come to the notion that in American politics today, for a variety of structural and social reasons, are no longer about persuading uncommitted voters. That we have this bit that there's this sort of big undecided lump in the middle, and that the reality of America is that that's not true. And so they have decided that America's national politics in the last decade or so has really been about mobilization rather than persuasion. And I think if you look at the way our electoral college system works, that's where the issues do come in play in a much more niche way, actually, than they used to be. So it may be, as a national matter, that the Supreme Court thing mobilizes Democrats more this time, right? That could actually be true. It could be true that healthcare has been a very good issue for Democrats, not just in this election year with the fate of Obamacare, that was arguably one of the issues that helped Democrats win back control of the House of Representatives in 2018. But, and I have the big but caveat here, does that really matter in the key county in Florida? Does it really matter in Western Pennsylvania, where Donald Trump says that Joe Biden is going to bow down to the crazy environmentalists and refuse to allow fracking, and therefore destroy the economy in Western Pennsylvania? You know, that could end up being what decides this election.
So you've already jumped ahead of me in terms of the issues I wanted to cover, and I want to just dwell on this issue of the stability of the race a little more. One thing that your biography reminded me of is just how abnormal this is in the sweep of American history. So in presidential elections before 2016, it was not uncommon to see a candidate's position change by 15 or 20 percentage points over the course of a campaign. George H.W. Bush, for example, in his 1988 campaign, came from pretty far behind to win the White House, 20 or 30 points, in fact, from where he was, I think, after the Democratic Convention. What does it mean that American political attitudes are now, graven in stone, that there is so little fluidity? What does it say about the sort of the cognitive universe of the American electorate?
Well, I think you're right to spotlight this. And I do think that the polarization that people talk about is real. When you and I were kids, the most competitive election, when I was growing up, when I was a little kid, it was 1976 between Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter. In that race, 24 of America's 50 states, basically half of them, were considered to be battleground states at the very end of the election. In 2012, the most recent election before Donald Trump, there were only 10 states that were considered competitive. Right now, we're talking about a handful of battleground states such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, that may decide this election, Florida, once again. So, the polarization, first of all, is real, and it is a structural long-term shift that predates Donald Trump, although in Trump, we found a politician who glories in that polarization, and in fact, his strategy is to exacerbate it and to double down on division and divisiveness. That's a very different response than you saw, say, from Barack Obama at the beginning of his presidency, when he talked about being a uniter, not a divider, and he talked about the things that Americans had in common. I don't know if Barack Obama came up today in politics, whether he would say those things anymore. But certainly in Trump, you have someone uniquely positioned to exploit that division. And so we're not even the same country that we were 4 years ago, and even the same country that we were in some ways 6 months ago. For example, during the pandemic, one thing I noticed was that this was a classic example where Trump's political decision to exploit the virus and to politicize the response to it actually had material consequences in people's actions and their views. So when they first started polling about mask wearing here in the United States, I know this is still astonishing to many of my international friends, but it was like it is in every other country. There was a small minority of people who were skeptical because they're skeptical of all government action. And like 80% of Americans in most of the surveys said, yes, we should listen to the public health advice and we should wear the masks. Well, guess what? Then when Trump launched a sustained campaign against it and questioned this and cheered on those people, then it became a sort of symbol of tribal loyalty to Donald Trump not to wear a mask. And he changed people's behavior and not just their stated opinions. And then the polls were a lagging indicator. So now they reflect the political divisions in our society, but they didn't originally.
So I would be remiss if we spent the entire time talking about Donald Trump, although I think most people would understand that. But I want to come back to another column that you wrote recently on that focused a lot on the Democratic candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden. And you ended the column by describing him as a romantic, which is an unusual term perhaps for an American politician, and a really unusual term for anyone in today's political fray. And I was wondering if you could unpack that a bit, and also tell me whether you think that that's a good thing. Democrats have often been accused of, to put it in a famous movie context, of bringing knives to gunfights. And so I'm curious what you mean by that phrase.
Well, I said he was an American romantic, and what I mean is that he is a believer in the myth and the romance of an America that he conjures up. In some ways, you could say that it is remarkable and kind of crazy that both candidates, right, are these septuagenarians who in some ways are rooted in the American past rather than in the American present, or certainly its future, right? And that's one of the notable aspects of the kind of leadership choices that we're being given at this kind of critical moment, not just for the US, but for the world. And so, Biden's version of the past is a more positive, gauzy version. Trump presents a vision of the past in which essentially white people ruled, and when things got out of hand, they were dealt with in a tough way, in a strong way. Biden conjures up the idea of American exceptionalism, right? And the notion of a country that wasn't perfect, but that was striving towards something better and towards a higher moral purpose. His is the America of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. His is the America that triumphed in World War II and sought to, make that never happen again. And so he campaigns, he literally says in his speeches, I want to make America, America again. And I think in the end, that's the heart of his appeal, along with a reputation and just a persona that exudes a kind of personal dignity and empathy that is in such stark contrast to Donald Trump's character and persona. And so in a way, his gauzy romanticism about America is matched by his own kind of corny, but kind of sincere love for Americans. And all of it is in a big contrast to the president that we have right now.
I think you're absolutely right about Biden's feeling about, the people he encounters and Americans. And so I wanted to ask you, what effect do you think the lockdown has had on this very, very strange election? So obviously, we know that President Trump has used it to come up with another nickname for Biden, calling him Hiding Biden, Hiding Biden. There's just never been anything quite like this where, well, one president is doing rallies, but the other one is being very careful. He's doing some events with small audiences. Do you think that this will affect the outcome in any way?
It's a good question. This is a campaign like no other. In some ways, it has been very helpful to Joe Biden, since his goal all along, the goal of any challenger running against an incumbent president of the United States is for the focus in many ways to be on the incumbent. It's much easier to knock down someone's record than it is to build yourself up to the stature of running against an incumbent president. So I think it served Biden in that sense. And of course, every day that we're talking about the divisive, controversial, and inadequate record of Trump, Democrats, generally speaking, feel that's a better day than when we're talking about ideology or when we're talking about the Supreme Court And so, in part, Trump's nicknames for Biden, I think, reflect a certain frustration that he hasn't been able to make his attacks on Biden stick in the same way that he felt that one of the keys to his success in 2016 was an ability to damage Hillary Clinton with name calling and reinforcing pre-existing doubts about her. So, Sleepy Joe Biden, hiding Biden, to me, they speak of Trump's frustration that he's landed blow after blow, and, it's not changed the race. It's not affected it at all.
So at the end of 2018, or in 2018, you carved out a lot of time from writing your column and actually did quite a lengthy piece on the relationship between President Trump and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And, it's interesting that with all the many huge, enormous issues that the Trump presidency has presented us with, that was something that really caught your interest. And I should say that you spent a fair amount of time in Berlin talking to people about it as well. So it's a peculiar relationship, and I recommend to everyone that they dig it out. I am curious, one of the things you talk about in there is your feelings about, or your assessment of Trump's broader views of Germany. And I'm curious if you want to project forward and imagine what that relationship would look like in a second Trump administration.
Well, I was fascinated by, why is Donald Trump, with all the things going on in the world, why has he been so obsessed with Angela Merkel? Why has he been so critical of her and Germany? What is it about that, and what does that tell us about Trump's broader views of allies as adversaries? While praising adversaries and authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and Erdogan in Turkey, Trump has reserved more vitriol for democratic leaders like Merkel than he has for those who genuinely present a threat to the United States. And so, in a way, it was, I thought, a really interesting and useful proxy for discussing the broader issue of Trump's perplexing foreign policy overall. Because really, there's no issue that has been with him for longer. And actually, that's the thing about Trump that you realize as soon as you look into his views about the world. It's not like he's a man with a coherent international relations theory of the case, but in fact, he does have certain strongly held biases, preconceptions, and views that go back really to the late 80s when he was sort of coming up professionally. And, actually, Chancellor Merkel, before meeting with Trump, one of the things she did to prepare, I was told, was not only to look at old episodes of The Apprentice, his TV show, but also to read an interview with Playboy magazine that Donald Trump did in the late 1980s, in which even then he was talking about unfair trade practices by Germany and at the time Japan as opposed to China, and how we were being ripped off so badly by our allies and we were being treated like suckers. Well, obviously that was useful reading, I would imagine, for the chancellor, because in fact, there's not an appearance even now today, 4 years into his presidency, where Donald Trump doesn't tend to digress into Germany bashing and complaining about how badly we're being treated by our allies. So I saw this as like kind of one of the templates for understanding Trump. And I do believe that were he to have a second term, his own former national security advisor, John Bolton, has said he believes that Trump would actually follow through on some of his hostile language toward NATO and possibly move to undermine the alliance in a more specific way. I would also note that in addition to criticizing Merkel, Trump has actually taken to calling the EU itself a foe of the United States and said that it was literally created in order to undermine and to hurt the United States, which of course is not true. So I would say that the story so far of his presidency is him finding ways to have fewer and fewer constraints on his actions. And therefore, even if he's not able to deliver on some of this rhetoric right away, over time, it may prove to be a more consistent guide to what he would like to do and may actually do, then I would be very skeptical of listening to what his advisors, especially those that come from the remnants of the Republican establishment, they do not have nearly as good of a record of credibility in speaking honestly about what Trump's foreign policy is than Trump himself is a better guide to what he might do.
Right. So, there's been talk both about possible withdrawal from NATO, undermining NATO, but also possible trade war. So both of those things, I think, are possibilities we have to take very seriously. So in a few minutes, we're going to open it up for questions. So anyone who's watching who wants to send in their question should do so. I see they're starting to come in, but I did want to ask you, as someone who has been living kind of a schizophrenic life between the Washington that James Baker encountered, I guess, first in the 70s, and then really shaped in an extraordinary way that you capture masterfully until the early 90s. Can you talk for a minute about how our politics, how Washington has changed? Give us a historical perspective, because I think we intuit a lot of it, but it's a lot more far-reaching than I think any of us has really wrapped our minds around.
Well, I think you're right about that, by the way. It's, a lot of people use this analogy of Washington in the Trump era as a sort of, the boiling frog, and the idea that we're sort of the frog in the pot, and its temperature just keeps getting heated up degree by degree, so we never notice until it's actually so hot that we're boiled to death. Look, the Baker Project started out, as I said, in the pre-Trump era, but it actually proved, I think, for Peter and I to be a really useful counterpoint and actually way for us to measure each day what we were doing in covering the Trump administration, because it gave us this foil. And really, from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, this was Baker's moment. It was, essentially the time when Washington ran the world, and Baker figured out how to run Washington. And the incentive structure has just changed so fundamentally since then. That's, I think, what we concluded. That for someone who wanted to win at politics, and our subject just happened to be fanatically competitive and a sort of congenital winner, it just so happened that the way to win was actually to make deals and to get things done. And that is his unique skill set. He's a natural negotiator. Even late in life, when everything else is stripped away, you tend to see what a person is like. He's now 90 years old. He still just takes pride and joy in cutting deals. For example, I'll give you a little example of that. Even in his 80s, the head of the Texas Episcopal Church came to him and said, there's a huge national outcry in the Episcopal Church over their decision to sanctify same-sex marriages. And across the southern United States, this was very controversial. And many of the southern Episcopal churches were breaking away. Well, this Texas Episcopal leader said to Jim Baker, please, we don't want to break away. How do we do this? And he cut a deal that essentially preserved Texas as the only church across the entire southern United States that found a way to stay as part of the National Episcopal Church. He got them essentially like a window of time, like a delay, before they would actually have to put it into effect. So the guy was a natural deal maker. And in politics, you could win that way because you were still aiming to appeal to the middle. He was a ruthless partisan during election years. He ran Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign in 1984. He ran the very nasty George H.W. Bush campaign in 1988 when he beat Michael Dukakis, who talked about that. Well, how did they come back from 17 points down at the end of the convention? The answer is they went negative and very dirty. And so it wasn't that he wasn't a partisan. It was that in even numbered years, he believed that the point of acquiring power was to use it and to do something with it. And there was a sense that was a recipe both for acting in the national interest, but also that it was good politics.
Yeah, and if I can just extend what you're saying a bit, it wasn't a politics of mutual assured destruction. It was a politics of temporary destruction, and that at the end, one person or one party might be lying in the dust, but you pick them up because you recognize that you had to legislate with them again, and you had to make the wheels of policy turn. And one of the striking things about Washington today is that the legislative wheels have come off, and Democrats complain endlessly about the number of bills that have been sent from the House to the Senate and are just sitting in Senator McConnell's inbox. So anyway, I highly recommend the book to all of our viewers. It's a great piece of Americana, really. I mean, it really does explain a period of our nation as through the lens of one extraordinary individual. So I'm going to turn now to questions, and I'm going to start by combining a couple of questions which are pretty much on the same issue, and ask you this: the questioners are interested to know what 2024 might look like, and this is a way of asking: is the fever going to break, or is America hostage to polarization as far as the eye can see?
Yeah, these are great questions, especially because the polarization predates Trump, and of course is likely to post-date it as well. If you look at our recent presidential elections, obviously Trump isn't even the first recent president to be elected without having received a majority or winning the popular vote. That also happened in 2000 when George W. Bush was declared the president, although Gore was a leader in terms of the popular vote. And by the way, Baker played a very crucial role in that. For the German audience who might not remember, he was called upon by his best friend's son, George W. Bush, to be his lead counsel and representative in that very contentious Florida recount. And one of the things we learned in doing the book was that Democrats understood just how ferocious and successful Baker was. As soon as they heard that it was going to be Baker up against Warren Christopher, Bill Clinton's former Secretary of State, they knew in their hearts that that Bush was going to win, and in fact he did do so. But so the polarization preexists the structural problem of our national democracy not being reflected in our electoral college process, which overweights essentially the votes and the voices of Americans in the smaller rural and more Republican states. So that's not going to go away. And then there's the incredible durability of Trump's appeal in these election polls that I talked about. The fact that his approval ratings at their lowest, they've never really sunk below the upper 30s. So that means essentially there's more than a third of the American electorate that was willing to support Donald Trump no matter what he did. And that's being generous, by the way. I mean, you could actually say 40% of the American electorate. But let's just say there's 5 points that are just such diehard Republicans that they actually don't even like it. Okay, so then fine, we're down to 35% of the American electorate. A very large chunk, and you already see a lot of Republican politicians competing for the loyalty of that group of people in the presumed 2024 primary. So people like Ted Cruz, who used to oppose Donald Trump but no longer do. That's one of the reasons why. You'll have senators like Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton from Arkansas, possibly Mike Pompeo, the current Secretary of State. Then there's Mike Pence, the vice president. Those people are all banking on a Trumpist wing of the Republican Party existing 4 years from now. Okay. Well, the unknown, of course, is what happens this November. Were Trump to be decisively repudiated and voted out of office, there certainly will be many Republicans here in Washington who pretend that they never knew the guy and, that they just had to hold their nose and support him, but that they were never really supportive of him. So I think you'll see a lot of infighting in the Republican Party that's contesting over the legacy of what just happened here. But it's wishful thinking if you think that these Trumpistas are just going to go away.
So it's kind of a Trumpian outcome, since Trump himself is famous for barely knowing people who have committed things that he considers to be beyond the pale in his administration or against him or what have you. Michael Cohen, barely knew him. So we have a question that I'm really glad someone asked, because we haven't talked about this so far. Someone asks, would you comment please on the role of Black Lives Matter and other protest movements with regard to the election campaign? And this, I guess, also carries on to the question of is the law and order theme for, the flip side is, will that theme work for Trump?
I'm really glad that this question was asked, because it seems that, racially coded appeals and even recently overtly racist appeals have been at the heart of Trump's political persona ever since he entered politics. And of course, he began his presidential campaigning career in 2015 by speaking about Mexicans as rapists and, running arguably an entire campaign 4 years ago, at the center of which were these very racially resonant warnings about the dangers of immigration from the South. And so that's always been a part of who he is politically. Those who have studied him and his biography and looked at him up close say that that's also just who he is as a person. He's a deeply racist person. When these protests began this year, he went even farther in that direction. And I think initially he thought, wow, this is how I'm going to recover my deficit with Joe Biden. I'm going to turn the campaign from coronavirus into a referendum on what he called law and order. And, he's internalized this idea that this is how Richard Nixon won the election in the United States in 1968, that he used essentially the riots and the civil disorder in the United States after the tragic assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and Bobby Kennedy, that civil unrest was turned into a benefit for Republicans. Now, of course, what Trump, I think, kind of forgot about was that Richard Nixon wasn't an incumbent in 1968, and Americans blamed LBJ for the country going to hell. And that's one of the reasons that LBJ didn't run for re-election. But so Trump thought law and order was going to work. But guess what? Have you seen him saying and tweeting law and order anytime in the last couple of weeks? The answer is it didn't really work. Now, these racially coded appeals in a campaign environment where we're just aiming at small segments of our pre-existing base to motivate them, right? Maybe that helped to solidify what could have been an even worse outcome for Trump in places like Wisconsin, which just had a recent terrible case of a police shooting earlier this month. So, I don't say that it has no effect on the election, because I do think Trump is using this language not to persuade, undecided voters, but to send a broadcast signal designed to be heard just by his own people. And the signal is, hey, listen, be afraid of these kind of rampaging looters, anarchists, protesters. They're coming for you. They're coming for your suburban housewives. And, trying to generate enough fear that they'll actually turn out in November.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And gets to another issue You mentioned suburban housewives, and of course the poll suggests that if the message was targeted at them and the thought that that there was going to be enormous crowds coming from the inner city to take over their towns, that has not been an effective message. But all of those analyses rely on polling. And one of the really fascinating developments of this election cycle is the unease with which we all look at the polls, having been through 2016. And so I'm kind of curious to hear how you, as a reporter and as someone who talks a lot to everyone in the press corps in Washington, are dealing with that uncertainty. I'm often asked what's going to happen. And I'll say, well, I gave up on my analytic skills in 2016. So over to you. What do you do about that?
Honestly, that is the question. I mean, it's like you can swear off these polls, but then, what were Peter and I doing sitting at the breakfast table this morning? I was like, oh, look at this guy on Twitter. He's figured out, there's some guy who's really smart. He's taken every day on Twitter. He has the Real Clear Politics average polls for this exact date in the, going back to the 2012 or 2008 election, right? So he tweets exactly, here's what, was the Obama-McCain, here's what the Obama-Romney, here's what the Trump-Clinton, and here is Trump-Biden for this exact date in September. And is there enough time? So as of this morning, that indices showed that Biden was +7, and this is an average of all the polls, right? So it's a rolling average of polls that are considered reliable enough to be included. And it has Biden as +7 this morning, and essentially that is a wider margin than any of the eventual winners had at this date as it gets closer and closer to the election. But that being said, right, like this is what probably is being replicated across breakfast tables all around Washington. Look, the truth is 4 years ago, I remember I was editor of Politico. People would ask me, what do you think about this? What do you think about the polls? I said, and I was accurate at the time, I said, if Trump wins, and he could still win, it would be the biggest upset in modern American political history. That was true. It was also true that happened, right? And, so this would be an even bigger upset. The polls are wider by a bit for Biden than they were for Hillary at this time. There are some disturbing battleground polls, like in Pennsylvania, for example, where it's much closer than you would think that it is. So, in fact, sometimes the tone of the coverage doesn't reflect just how close it is in Pennsylvania right now. So I definitely don't rule out a Trump win at this point. It is definitely possible, but for all the reasons we've just been talking about, it's very hard to imagine a very large number of Americans changing their minds and becoming favorably inclined toward Donald Trump at this point. So I would say this. The reason that you hear Americans right now kind of freaking out about the post-election day scenarios is because while there is a chance of Trump winning still, there's no chance, I would say, of him winning big, which means that he could win only in a very, very close or even too close to call type election, which would, of course, cast a lot of doubt on the results.
So a follow-on question to that from very distinguished reporter and Germany expert Elizabeth Pond. Do you share Bart Gellman's alarm about the possibility of Trump just refusing to concede in the case of a Biden victory? And by extension, do you see that leading to social unrest?
Yes. I think that at this point in time, nobody should be sanguine about the results and what's going to happen in November. Maybe 3 weeks from now, the polls in the battleground states will be wider and there will be a bigger margin, more like the national margin. Biden is winning by 7 points right now, or 9 points in some of the polls nationally. Were he to open up a lead of that size in some of the key states, like Pennsylvania, or Florida, but I don't see that happening in October, then you would say, okay, that scenario might be overblown. But I think as of right now, you should be very concerned about that happening, number one. Number two, when the president has already said that the election is going to be rigged. He's been saying this for months with increasing fervor and velocity to it. This is a measure of how things have changed, how I have changed, how I look at what's possible in America. 4 years ago, people forget this, but Donald Trump also said in advance of the election that the results were going to be rigged. He also said that he would refuse to commit in advance to agree and to accept the outcome. At the time, I discounted that. And I remember saying to people, you know, he's just bluster, and this is the way he is, and if he loses, he's just going to lose. I'm much less sanguine about that today. What I would say is the way our system works, if the Electoral College actually does meet and certify that Donald Trump has lost and that Joe Biden has won, which they're supposed to do in early January 6th, if that happens, he's gone. And I am actually not at all worried. If there's a certification in the election and Trump is losing, you know, it doesn't matter if he shows up on January 20th at the inauguration. You know, he will be definitely escorted out of the White House. So the question is, what can happen between November 3rd and January 6th when the Electoral College meets?
I'm really glad you made that point. I get asked that all the time. You know, does he have a Praetorian Guard that's going to allow him to stay? And, you know, I certainly agree with you on that one, that there's no one's going to be defending the White House gate, then that that part of America has not changed. So we've had a whole bunch of questions that I'm going to try to roll together on on a related subject that you know a lot about, and that is Vladimir Putin. How would you assess his influence on this election? Do you have anything you want to say about the Trump-Putin relationship? A lot of people, of course, in Germany are wondering what the future of Nord Stream 2 is, which I'm sure you're well aware of, the gas pipeline coming in from Russia into northeastern Germany. So over to you with that bundle of big questions.
Yes, they are big questions. And isn't it amazing that here we are 4 years into this presidency and we still can't really say for sure what is behind the president of the United States' bizarre admiration for Vladimir Putin. We still don't really know the answer to that question. What we do know is that not only has Trump persisted in his insistence on praising Putin and his desire for a reset and a more positive relationship with Russia, he's done so even where politically that is not necessarily advantageous to him. He's persisted in it, even though this is something where there is actually a rare bipartisan consensus in Washington, and you have Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill who remain deeply skeptical about Putin and troubled by his influence. So, you know, it is a paradox in that there's not even an obvious political advantage of any kind for Trump to do this, number one. Number two, Putin's malign influence in the United States and determination to intervene in the election has been reaffirmed as recently as last week by the director of the FBI, who testified under oath on Capitol Hill. And again, this is a director of the FBI that was appointed by Donald Trump. And he said, yes, Putin is intervening in the US election, and he is doing so with the goal of reelecting Donald Trump. Just as 4 years ago, the goal of the Russian election interference, it was not just to divide Americans or to exploit pre-existing weaknesses in our society. It was to do that with the aim of helping Donald Trump's campaign. And so I find that to be very significant. And I would say, really, for the second national election in a row, we're probably under covering that rather than over covering that. That's very significant. And it's especially significant because it appears that the FBI has determined that this is a different kind of election interference than what we're seeing from other adversarial countries like China and Iran, which are also, kind of mucking around, but not doing so in a sustained way. And so it's once again a major Kremlin operation. And I find that to be very worrisome, especially in the context of the Navalny poisoning, especially in the context of Putin feeling the weakness, perhaps internally, of his government. And historically, over the last 2 decades, when Putin has felt threatened at home is when he is most likely to lash out abroad. And I think that's what we're seeing once again.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary open file. If Joe Biden does win, it's going to be one of the really fascinating challenges of how do you deal with Vladimir Putin, who's meddled in 2 elections and also has, an enormous nuclear arsenal. We need a floor under the relationship, but we have a number of concerns that are hard to allay. So I want to go to another question that is relevant to one of your recent columns. You wrote about Olivia Troy, the young staffer for the vice president who was on the coronavirus commission. And you wrote, I think, really persuasively about how she'd put everything on the line to come out and say that she felt that the president was pursuing his own political interests and not attending to the health and welfare of the American people. And you pointed out that, she'd really taken a risk, and that many of the so-called adults in the room, some of the more distinguished and still respected people who had worked for Donald Trump, had not really come clean with the American people in the way that many have suggested they should have. So our questioner asks, have the American elites failed the American public in the case of Donald Trump? And how would you answer that? Yes.
Yeah. History teaches us that, no matter how much a dictator or strongman says, "I'm the only one who matters," and that's actually a direct quote from Donald Trump, that in fact he's not the only one, and that Donald Trump could not govern the United States without the help of an entire, thousands and thousands of people. And many people have cycled in and out of his White House and his administration, and they have enabled his abuses of power and his, in the case of the coronavirus, reckless and deadly disregard for public health advice and for the basic principles of good organization and competent governance, which is the reason that we elect leaders in the first place. And so, I found it to be extraordinary and very painful, actually, to have this conversation last Thursday with Olivia Troy, not someone I knew. She's a classic example of the sort of anonymous civil servant. She spent her career. She told me that she had decided to enter national security because she was a young intern at the Republican National Committee on the day that the attacks of September 11, 2001 occurred. And she was in Washington, and she walked home past the Pentagon, which was on fire, and she decided to become a civil servant and to work in national security. She was detailed from the Intelligence Department at the Department of Homeland Security to work in the White House under Vice President Pence. And she, told me that she had qualms about doing so. She was not a fan of Donald Trump's, although she's a Republican her whole life, but she felt that it was her responsibility. Then she became on the coronavirus task force, and she was disturbed by what she saw, which, by the way, what she told me about what she saw privately was a lot of what we've seen publicly. And I think it just makes it all the more horrifying that these government officials whose salaries we're paying to work for us and to protect us, that they're not speaking out. In a democracy, it depends on everybody in the democracy doing their part. And that's the whole thing that makes it different from an autocracy and from a dictatorship. And so I find this to be a catastrophic failure by the people who have worked with Donald Trump, by the people who are in his political party, and by those who have seen it up close and firsthand and failed to speak out or done so only through others. So you see all these tell-all accounts, and Bob Woodward's book has what Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, and Dan Coates, the former Director of National Intelligence and former ambassador to Germany. Why don't these men have the courage that a 40-year-old young woman in the middle of her career has? I think it's shameful, honestly. I think it's shameful.
So we have a question from someone who I believe you know. I'm not 100% sure whether this is from Peter Wittig or his wife Huberta von Voss. I hope I've got that right. But the question is, polarization is not just Trump's fault, but also due to the algorithmic architecture of social media. How likely is it that a Biden administration would regulate that? Huge issue, and I have no idea.
It is a huge issue, and I have no idea. You've definitely seen a huge kind of change in the views of the big social media companies over the course of the last few years. Obviously there's been a sort of real crisis of confidence in Facebook, and an idea that somehow, whatever the personal politics of Mark Zuckerberg, that in fact Facebook has sort of been one of the key enablers of the Trump presidency and is a sort of a tainted political public space at this point. The appetite in the United States, as you know, is much less than it is in Europe for anything that smacks of restrictions on free speech or prioritizing even of privacy over speech rights. And this has now become sort of a cause célèbre on the right as well. Actually, Donald Trump has whole conferences on free speech and social media at the White House. And part of the culture war that they have going up to the election is saying that essentially his liberal critics and Democrats are aiming to curb their free speech. And so I think this is just yet another area where there's no consensus in American society, and it's been very polarized. In fact, you can now identify what the politics of somebody are by what social media platform they're using.
So I think we're coming close to the end, and I want to turn the tables a little on you. You spoke about how you feel that the American elites have failed. I'd ask you now to rate how the press has done in an extraordinarily difficult set of circumstances. I mean, it's very hard to look at Twitter, for example, without seeing people absolutely enraged that, for example, the New York Times hasn't used the term lie to describe.
They have, by the way, just they don't always use it, but they have.
Well, nonetheless, there are a lot of questions and a lot of very heated debate. It's not a very organized debate right now, but I'm curious how you think the press is doing in this extraordinarily difficult environment. Well,
look, this is a moment to be humble and to recognize that none of us really has an ideal answer to this. I will say, having spent 4 years in Russia and traveling the former Soviet Union, that it has been a very painful and almost out-of-body experience to have the President of the United States call the media for the last 4 years the enemies of the people. Anyone who's lived in Russia knows that vrag naroda, enemy of the people, was literally the official term by which Stalin condemned millions of people to the gulag and to death. And of course, Trump and those surrounding him, his enablers, know that full well at this point. And so, it's a political campaign on the one hand that has been very purposeful and calculated from the very beginning of the presidency to make the media and not just the Democrats the enemy in this situation. And, people with authoritarian mindsets like Donald Trump, they seek enemies, and that's their political persona. So that's part of it. Then there's the question of how should journalists respond to this? And I do think, for me, it's been very painful and hard to watch one of our basic core tenets as journalists be challenged here, which is the idea that essentially our job was not imposing consequences, but simply shedding light on events. And then it was up to the American electorate to do their job. There's this famous phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant. You know, that we journalists were the people who we would pick up the rock of American politics and show you all the creepy, crawly, disgusting things underneath. And then you, the American people, would figure out what to do about it. So now we realize that essentially we have the problem of accountability, that transparency we have more of than ever before. And I do think that there's been fantastic, terrific, amazing, important reporting, both investigative reporting, explanatory reporting, analysis, bearing witness. Honestly, there's been a lot of great journalism done. The reason that there's a crisis is because the link between transparency and accountability appears to be severed in a political system that is no longer working as any of us have previously experienced it.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant analysis. I have to say, as a compulsive newspaper reader, it has been great to see the press revived in many ways after years of economic pressure by a great story, and to see so much competition between the great publications in the U.S. And of course, the president's fond of talking about the failing New York Times, which has pumped up its circulation dramatically and its advertising in this period. So we should bring this to a close with a big thanks for really a fascinating conversation, and a demand that the conversation continue here in Berlin sometime in the not too distant future. I have a feeling we won't be seeing you before January 20th, but I hope it won't be very long after. And with any luck, we'll have put the worst of this pandemic behind us, and we'll have a full house for you here at the American Academy. So with that, I hope you sell 1 million books, and all the best. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for a wonderful conversation, for great questions. And, I do hope our German friends will keep the doors of asylum open if I and the other enemies of the people should use it. You've been very welcoming to the refugees of the world recently. So thank you for that in advance. And thank you, Dan.
And I look forward to seeing that next column posted. Take care.
Thank you.